Dr. Crocione here. This is something a little bit different. This is going to be a supplemental lecture video. So most of the supplemental videos are just YouTube videos that I would normally have shown in class and that I think are still worth your time. This is one where this would normally have been part of lecture. It isn't strictly necessary to answer any of the 3 lecture study questions. It's more of an introduction into not even what prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination are. That's going to be in the next video lecture, but really a deeper question of why they exist, right? So you don't strictly need this one. If you don't watch this video, you should still be able to answer the study questions in your learning guide just fine. But if you've got, however long this ends up taking, 15 minutes probably to spare, I think this one's worth watching because I do think it's important to sort of understand where these phenomena come from in the first place. And what I mean by that is, why do people do this, right? Prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination, and you'll get more on this in the next video, but prejudice, broadly speaking, is how you feel about somebody because of the group you perceive them to be in, and that's important, right? It's not how you feel about a specific individual because of your interactions with that person. It's looking at somebody saying, okay, I perceive you to be in this group, whether you're really in it or not, and because you're in that group, it causes me to feel a certain way about you. Stereotyping is the beliefs you have about people based on the groups you think they're members of. So if somebody is from a certain nationality, ethnicity, a certain race, a certain gender, a certain political party, a certain part of the country, whatever, and you have prejudged beliefs about them, that's a stereotype. Discrimination is behavioral. It's how you actually treat people differently. And sadly, these are not American phenomena, which is not to say they don't happen in America. They certainly do, but when you and I think about things like racism or sexism or homophobia or other forms of bigotry, you're probably thinking of them in an American context, and you're probably thinking of that sort of big 3, as it were. And that's because, like me, you're probably an American. You probably grew up in America. You definitely live in America right now. It's what's been most relevant to you. It's been what's been most relevant to our history, but that can blind us to the fact that this is not either isolated to this country nor isolated to the present time. Sadly, these things have been with us probably as long as there have been people interacting. You don't even need nations and ethnicities to see this. And so what I want to do in this one is just talk a little bit about why. Why is this part of the human condition? This is not to say that it's good that it's part of the human condition, but I think understanding where it comes from is an important first step if you want to understand, say, how to combat it or how to deal with it. So it sort of starts, innocuously enough, with something called the need to belong. We're all driven to find other people to form groups with and to affiliate with. And this is hardwired evolutionarily into our brains. We, or our ancestors rather, wouldn't have done very well by themselves, right? If you put us next to the sorts of things 50, 60, 70, 100,000 years ago that we would have been living around, that we wanted to eat or that wanted to eat us, we don't stack up favorably in any one-on-one matchups. You're not going to bring down a woolly mammoth or even a bison by yourself, probably, certainly not with naught but a rock or a spear. And if a saber-toothed tiger wants to eat you, it's going to eat you. So we needed other people, right? And we have this deeply ingrained, powerful need to affiliate. But there are dark sides to that, and we see the need to belong all over the place. You see it in sports fandoms, you see it in our pride in our nationalities, you see it in religions, you see it in less important ways, like joining clubs or organizations that reflect your interests, joining a guild in World of Warcraft, identifying with your neighborhood, whatever it happens to be, right? What's the dark side here? Once you have a group that you're a member of, once you have an in-group, is the term that we use, other groups become out-groups, right? And we tend to favor the people in our group and to sort of look askance at the people out of our group. And this is true for any kind of groups that you look at. Sports fandom, I think, works really well as an example here, because if you're into sports at all, you've got your team, and your team's got their big rivals, and then you have the other teams that aren't your team that you care less about to varying degrees. And you probably do feel a strong sense of loyalty to your team. You wear your team's colors, you cheer for your team, and you probably do get a little uncomfortable, or at least not like those other people, right? I'm a huge LSU fan, and I'd be lying if I said that when I learned that somebody's an Alabama fan, I don't kind of want to keep them at arm's distance, right? Now, this is silly and stupid, and we all kind of understand that, but if something that trivial can produce this sort of in-group, out-group feeling, imagine what happens when it's something that you hold more deeply as part of your identity, like your ethnicity or your religion or your culture, right? So if you've got the time right now, actually pause this video and watch the supplemental video, In Groups and Out Groups. It's about 5 minutes long. It's not a really long one. I think it's worth watching, and it's going to show you essentially this one particular school in England and the very trivial distinctions these students have created between themselves that have turned into very real groups. High school's another good example of this. You probably had your social circle and your friend group, and whether you had names for yourselves, like the kids in this video, or not, you identified with your group, and you probably did sort of dislike those other groups who weren't as cool as you and weren't as good as you and weren't as smart as you, or whatever the distinctions were that you drew. So we naturally sort ourselves into groups, and once we're in those groups, we become distrustful of the out-group. We don't like the out-group as much. We have a natural aversion to the out-group. And it's more than just that. There's an effect called the out-group homogeneity bias, which is a fancy way of saying everybody not in your group starts to look the same to you. And this has been well documented in the literature. It's been documented, for example, within race. People are better at telling different faces apart when those faces are members of their own race than when they're members of other races. This is not just something that white people do or just black people do. You know, pick your race. You're probably better at differentiating among other faces of people within your race than who are not in your race. And it goes beyond that. You literally just start to think of people not in your group as basically all the same. And there's a reason for that, right? Who do you have contact with? Who do you affiliate with? Who do you get to know? People in your group, right? You know lots of Texans. You know lots of Lubbockites. You know that they're all very different from each other, right? This is the part in the lecture where if we were all in the same room, I tell you to look around the room and say, you know, there are some ways that we're all similar, but, you know, in a lot of ways we're all different. We don't all fit the stereotype of a Texan. We're not all firing 6-shooters into the air wearing cowboy hats all the time, right? You know that about Texans. But you don't know that about Californians. You don't know that about Canadians. You don't know that about Europeans, probably, because you're not those groups. You don't know those people. All you've got to go on is what you've heard. All you've got to go on is the generalizations. And so, because of a lack of contact, really, you don't know about the diversity of the outgroup. And so it's easy to start assuming that they're all pretty much the same, and that feeds into stereotypes. Well, I don't know many people from your group, but I know about your group, and so I can make certain assumptions about you. That's also just sort of a broader, or a narrower, rather, application of that representativeness heuristic that we talked about in class. I'll come back to that in the stereotyping portion of the next lecture. And another just really great example of this outgroup homogeneity bias is the Ain't Texas stickers and t-shirts, where you've got Texas and the rest of the country ain't Texas, right? And of course this is meant tongue-in-cheek, it's a joke, but there's some truth to it, right? Texans are not unique in this, but I think Texas especially has a lot of state pride. Texans really feel like they are unique and they are different and they are special and everybody else is basically the same, right? That's that outgroup homogeneity bias at work. So far we've seen you affiliate naturally because of the need to belong. Once you're in a group, you have these outgroups that you don't trust as much and you don't know as much about. And the last step is we like similar people. Remember that in the judgment and decision-making lecture, we talked about those positivity biases, the self-serving bias, that we, most of us, about 80% of us, tend to have this self-serving bias whereby you really like yourself. Remember the example where people thought that they were more likely themselves to go to heaven than Mother Teresa was, right? That was a good example of that self-serving bias, that we think we are all perfect and wonderful and special. Well, if you're your favorite person, and for many people that's true, you don't have to be a narcissist for that to be the reality, that's just kind of how most people's brains are wired. If you're your favorite person, well, then who's your next favorite person? The person next most like you. And then who's after that? Well, the next most like you, and so on. And so we prefer similar others, people who are similar to us in attractiveness. For example, a lot of studies have shown that romantic couples tend to be pretty close to each other in physical attractiveness. Even groups of friends don't tend to vary much in terms of physical attractiveness. And this is probably not, we're not looking at people and actively grading, okay, well, I'm a 7 and that's a 6.5, so we're probably good. Most of this is a system 1 process. We're just naturally sort of sorted and drawn to people who are similar to us in attractiveness, people who are similar to us in beliefs and values. We even non-consciously mimic people who we like. Once we like someone, if we want to build rapport and affiliation with someone, we will, without even thinking about it, System 1 again, just kind of start doing what they're doing. We'll mimic their body language. We'll mimic their posture. We'll laugh when they laugh, right? They've even shown that if you instruct a Confederate to do this, remember Confederate's in on it, that someone will like that Confederate more. Now, you can do it too much and it can get really creepy. If you literally mirror the other person, that's going to backfire. And there's nuances to this we don't have time to get into, but generally speaking, we do this naturally. If two people are getting along well, you'll start to see that kind of behavioral symmetry show up. And if you slightly affect it and you know how to do it well, you can even produce liking in another person in some contexts. And again, why? Because we like us. So if we're coming back to this idea then, why stereotyping? Why prejudice? Why discrimination? Well, we naturally want to affiliate. Who do we want to affiliate with? People like us, because we're our favorite person, so the more like me you are, the more I like you, and the more I want to affiliate with you. Once we have formed those affiliations, we have an in-group, but what happens? Now we got an out-group, and evolutionarily, a lot of times you probably would have been competing with those out-groups for resources, or for prey, or for prime land, or something like that. So we don't trust that out-group, and we don't know that out-group. We don't have contact with that out-group, and so we recognize the diversity of our in-group, but we fail to see it in the out-group, which can create this sense of out-group homogeneity bias. And all of this comes together to sort of explain why, despite the fact that it's pretty bad, we do have somewhat of a natural inclination to prefer similar others, distrust dissimilar others, and to make prejudgments and use stereotypes about people from groups we don't have a lot of contact with and don't have a lot of personal knowledge of. And if you got time here, this one's a little bit longer. It's about a 15-minute video, but definitely worth your time. It's got cute babies in it, which is a bonus. But if you want to see, for example, that babies are little bigots in some ways, check this video out. It's linked in the supplemental videos on your learning module. And it looks at some of the ways in which, on the one hand, babies have an innate sense of morality, but on the other, that innate sense of morality is constrained by some of these things like preference for similarity and in-group, out-group biases. So check that one out. This is the end of the supplemental lecture video, and the next one is going to start addressing the learning objectives from your learning guide. So Dr. Crescione signing out.